We'll see how this works. There's a general rule of thumb that after a whole day of conference, you can't really take any more law or any more economics. So I'm going to switch to psychology more or less, but we'll pretend it's law since I teach at a law school. So my presentation is going to focus on certain board behaviors. A couple of things I'm going to do may or may not work because there's, of course, a language difference. We know that the things I'm going to talk about, in fact, do cross cultural barriers. So they are very consistent across different nationalities, different cultures, and different languages in their native language. But you won't necessarily be getting that, and though the translation is excellent, I talk too fast, but I'll try to be slow, and the translation loses a little bit. But we'll see how it goes, so we'll try it out. So first, let's talk about why we would care about this. Do the little things matter? When I say little things, I'm not saying big things. I'm not saying the basic concept of independent directors, the issues of control, the broad swath of corporate governance law as you know it. I'm talking about little behaviors inside the boardroom, around materials, around all sorts of what might seem like silly things. So first, what if the way you arranged your board meeting seating changed how well you performed? That would be interesting to know, right? What if there was a configuration that altered the behavior of how people talk to each other, how they vote, how they interact, how easy it is to persuade someone or not? So that would be interesting to explore. What if the time of day when you discuss a critical issue impacts whether or not you get it right or wrong? What I mean is perhaps a difficult topic at the end of the day, maybe that comes out differently depending if it involves risk measurements, if it involves quantitative analysis, depending how long you've been up, whether or not your blood glucose level is high or low. What if the ratio of phone conference calls to live meetings radically changed how much risk you're willing to take? In other words, what if it turns out that if you're talking on a phone line and you hear disembodied voices, instead of seeing people in front of you, you vote yes more often for risky endeavors? What if that happened? That'd be interesting to know, right? And then what if how you asked your questions in a boardroom to management or to other directors, what if that altered whether others would listen to the answer? So what if how you framed questions changed whether or not when someone gives the answer, other people listen? So here's what we know about these things. All of these things under different circumstances come into play. And what's very interesting in the last 5 to 10 years is that both technology and psychology and neurobiology, and then the lawyers are interested in all these things, so we're kind of watching from afar, have advanced in a way that allows for the testing and evaluation of some of these concepts. I would say it's all still relatively early, though there are a few things that have become pretty clear and are very consistent. And I'll highlight which ones are a little more speculative, where we can say, well, there's something there, we're just not quite sure what it is, and others where we say, no, this one we know for sure, and I'll highlight those differences. So all of these things actually are in play. It's not always conclusive how it works out. So what can independent directors really do? Well, that's a big debate. It's bigger than my session. It was addressed already by Professor Klausner. I think it was addressed in all the different panels in different ways. So one of the bottom realistic expected utilities of an independent director in terms of how they interact is arguably more than simple legal compliance. So part of what we've been doing today is talking about the bottom bar of what if you don't do it right, or if you don't engage correctly, or maybe we should change the bar and raise it or alter it. We've been talking about the legal line, but I assume we would all agree that the legal line is not the aspirational goal. Right? So I take that as my point, granted, number one. Two, I'm going to assume that the director or directors in question are well-intentioned and honest and earnest, and they mean well. And in my experience, at least in the United States, and my casual observations in Chile and Brazil and other places, is that that's almost always true. It is very unusual to find someone who is sinister and clever and ongoing trying to do bad things. Maybe that happens, but I'm actually setting that aside. This isn't about people trying to commit blatant fraud or take advantage inside the boardroom. I'll highlight a couple circumstances, but by and large, I assume everyone's honest. So the first thing we're going to do, can we pass out that quiz? Thanks. So we're going to do a little confidence test. There is a phenomena among humans generally, and an even stronger phenomena among successful humans about our ability to discern the sense of our own knowledge and how confident we are in that knowledge. So we're just passing out a little quiz. Now don't go online, don't check your BlackBerry or iPhone, no cheating on this. This is a quiz that's intended to ask you questions Everyone's going to get a quiz, but then I'm going to break some folks over here into a little bit of a group. But bear with me. We're going to have everybody answer this set of questions. There's 10 questions, so don't start yet, because I'll describe a couple things to help you get it right. There are 10 questions, and they're questions that you probably might know the answer to. Maybe you've heard the answer. It's hard to know. If you've already done this quiz, opt out. Don't do it, because it's cheating if you've already done it. But what I need you to do is to look at the question. So down at the bottom here, which is the top example, it says, what is the typical length of a newborn blue whale calf? Well, I have no idea, although I did this presentation in Alaska for a Native Alaskan tribe, and they all knew, which was kind of funny. So I would, not really knowing, I would guess a low number and a high number. And the goal of the quiz is for you with high confidence to write a low estimate and a high estimate such that you are 90% sure, that's pretty sure, such that you're 90% sure that the answer is going to fall within that range. So I would have written 19 to 25 feet. 19 is my low, 25 is my high. I would have hoped that it landed, I felt pretty good about that, I would have hoped it landed in the middle. So again, what you do is you go through all those questions and you write your low number, your high number. And notice I've got English measurements. It just makes it harder, it's part of the quiz. So I got to do it in English measurements. So take a look now. What I'm going to do over here, though, so everyone over here is going to do it individually, but I would like 1, 2, 3, 4. If you guys could confer for like 3 or 4 minutes and come up with the answers, and then you 5, same thing. If you guys could kind of talk to each other, fill out 1, and kind of decide what your answers are. So I'm just going to give you 4 minutes to do this. That's all you get. So remember, write your low estimate and your high estimate, and then we're going to grade them. You're supposed to be pretty sure. Oh, and by the way, there's a prize. So a prize for the narrowest, right? If you can't miss more than 3, but if a prize for the narrowest, you will get a copy, which I will send to you. I'll get your name later, of the book that I'm going to be talking about a little later today. It's called Willful Blindness. So there's a prize. There's something at stake. So go ahead and get started. You got about 3.5 minutes. All right, we're going to use the honor system to allow you to score your own. So you put a check mark if it's right. You put a big X if it's wrong on the number, okay? Because it's going to matter. Okay, groups, you all set? You got to be done. Just miss the ones you're not done with. All right, just guess on the last 3. You done? Uh-oh. All right, we're going to let the group go for about 30 more seconds. And I mean it. All right, while they're finishing up, I'm going to tell you a couple of things that we know from this. We've been doing these overconfidence studies for a long time. There's lots of different versions. You'll get the PowerPoint slides copies, and it's a good starting point. If you kind of Google this confidence decision making, 100 interesting websites, academic pieces, charts, online quizzes will all pop up. So you can kind of do this for yourself. All right, you guys ready? Guys, give it up. They are really determined to get it right. They want the book. Ready? All right. Okay, now turn around. We're good. Okay, so here's the first thing. Humans are very bad at knowing the difference. Humans are very bad at knowing the difference between recall and guessing. But it activates different parts of your brain. We now know this quite clearly. So one of the funny things that happens is most people, as you went through this, you had this sense that you should know these answers. You know, they're kind of esoteric, but we're all very well educated. And you think to yourself, I've got to know how many books are in the Old Testament. How can I not know that? I got to know that, right? And so you're trying to dig into your brain and pluck out that memory. But chances are, as it turns out, the majority of you actually don't know exactly how many books are in the Old Testament. And so what happens is you access a part of your brain that kicks off a whole series of other activities, which then muddle the process of actually guessing. So I'm going to give you the answers. We're going to score it, and then I'll answer questions. Question. Slower. Oh, I'm sorry. Thank you. I will do that. Okay. So, sorry. All right. Answers to the quiz. So please grade your quiz. The first one. Martin Luther King died at age 39. The Nile River is 4,187 miles long. OPEC, 13 nations. Old Testament, 39. Moon diameter, 2,160 miles. 747 empty weight, 390,000 pounds. Mozart, 1756. Elephant gestation in days. This is a long time, huh? 645 days. Tokyo, London, 5,959 miles. Deepest known ocean depth, that matters a little, 36,198 feet. Okay, so how many got all 10 right? Okay, how many people got 9 right, which is what you're supposed to get, right? Ooh, okay. How many people, 8 or more? 8 or more? How many people got 7 or more? So he's the winner of the book, right? Because everyone else got disqualified? Okay. So let me ask, how many people missed 5 or more? How many people missed all 10? How many people won't admit it? How many people missed 9 or more? How'd the groups do? What'd you guys do? 3 right? How many did you guys get right? 3? Okay. So one of the interesting phenomena that occurs, but it's hard to predict in advance, and I probably didn't give you enough time, is that groups of intelligent, articulate people actually do much, much worse. And here's why. Because what happens is one of you will say, you know, I feel pretty strongly that I know this one. And so instead of everyone kind of giving their guess, and whoever's is the lowest, you put that one down, and whoever's is the highest, you put that one down, what most groups do is they defer to an internal expert. They say, no, I know how many books in the Old Testament. And they put that narrow range. And so they actually have much narrower ranges as groups on average. Okay, so why does this matter? Why do we care? We won't have time to do this, but if I gave you the exact same quiz at the end of the session, most of you would miss more than 4. You would still miss a bunch because you wouldn't remember, but you kind of think you remembered the answers. And so you would still miss a bunch. And why do we care about this? We care about this because overconfidence actually manifests not as an issue of knowledge. It's unlikely that you're going to have a moment where if you don't answer something correctly, really bad things happen right then. That's unlikely. But what could happen is in your own self-assessment of how you're performing cognitively, as a practical matter, and it may be an evolutionary advantage, we're pretty sure most of the time that we're doing pretty well. And this overestimation, this overconfidence in our ability to perform under certain circumstances creates weaknesses and vulnerabilities in our decision making. So we'll kind of keep moving. If you could do me a favor and on the back of your piece of paper, write your group letter. So you guys are all B's and you guys are all A's. So write A or write your letter. And then I'm going to collect them afterwards. So on your quiz, just on the back, you don't have to have your name on it, but write your letter. You guys are A's. Okay. So, question for the audience. We're going to do a similar kind of exercise to see if we can get our thinking going. So this is this is relevant because American Medical Association, the diagnostics specialist subgroup, had this question about 8 years ago. And they didn't do very well on it, and I'm going to talk about why, but we'll kind of go through it ourselves. So it's just a quantitative analytics question. It's not real hard. It doesn't require algebra or anything. So imagine that there is a disease that we know in a town is manifesting at a rate of 1 per 1,000 people. And let's make it easy and imagine the town only has 1,000 people, exactly 1,000 people. There's a test that is 95% accurate and has a false positive rate of 5%. And for a variety of reasons, the town gets completely tested. Everyone gets tested. So you're the doctor in town, and one of your patients comes up to you and says, doctor, I tested positive for this test. What are the chances I have the disease? So let's stop there for a second and give me some guesses. And I'm going to make it easier for you if you get it wrong because the majority of the medical diagnosticians got it wrong on their first run at this. So what do you think? What's the most likely answer that kind of jumps out at you? Any ideas? I know you want to say it, you just don't want to say it out loud because you're worried that it's wrong. Evan, what would be, yes? 5 in 100,000. No. But you guessed in the other direction than most people guess. Do you know what the most common answer from a group is? 95%, right? It's an intuitive answer. I'll tell you why that feels like the right answer. Because when you're tired and towards the end of the day, and unless you revel in math in your head, unless that just makes you so happy, chances are your visual exposure to a number dominates your likely calculation of the outcome. Because it kind of feels right. And there's this function in your brain that just wants to be efficient and take shortcuts that help you. And that shortcutting mechanism, because most of us are a little bit math averse, causes you to glom onto the 95%. In fact, just so we can do it quickly, and this is, I mainly point this out so that you're aware of it, right? So don't do calculations in your head. Don't go with your intuition on an analytical, something that actually has an answer. Make someone who's really good and does this all the time calculate the answer for you. But if you test 1,000 people with a 5% false positive rate, how many positive tests do you get? 50. You get 50. And then you have one real positive, because we know the rate's 1 in 1,000. So total positive tests will be 51, probably, if everything is statistically expected. So the person in front of you is one person. And so the randomized opportunity of them to be the one is 1 out of 51. So it's less than 2%. So if the follow-up treatment for that was either really, really expensive or really, really dangerous, it would be a terrible thing that 53% of diagnostic AMA members thought that the answer was 95%. As a side note, the way you double check it is if it's a random false positive, like it's a testing error kind of thing, then you just retest again, and you retest again, and it sorts it out. So I mention this only because the inclination for your answer was 95%, probably, and you have to be careful about why you want to do that. Okay, so let's do a couple quick perception exercises, and then let's see if I can get this right. See if this works. So one of the things I'm going to talk about a little bit more is our ability to perceive changes and other things. Some of you will have seen the second one I'm going to show you, but a lot of you will not have seen this one, I don't think. So the trick is just watch what it says and do what it says.
Watch this short film and try to spot the change. Only one thing will change. Did you see it? Few people notice it, even though it happened in plain sight.
And the panel has a monitor in front of them if you guys want to look forward.
Changed. We think changes draw attention, but we don't realize how much we can miss. We're blind to our own change blindness. Now that you know what's changing, you can actually see the change happening. It just doesn't draw your attention automatically. Watch it again.
So this is a test designed now more than a decade ago. So this is a great book, by the way. So this is of consequence, mainly because change is one of the most important things that independent directors can start to observe. But if it's incremental, it's hard to spot. There's a lot of reasons that we feel like we can spot change, but it turns out that it's actually quite difficult to spot change. Dan Simons is probably the most famous guy who works on issues of visual perception, and he's done lots of interesting experiments. And this is his other one, which if you've seen it, don't say anything because once you've seen it, it's easier to know what's going on. So what you're supposed to do is just count how many times the player's wearing white past the ball. So it's kind of a visual acuity test, and we'll just see how we do. So how many people have seen this before? Several of you. Okay, so kind of the front. You guys haven't. That's good. Okay, we'll see what happens.
Many times the players wearing white pass the ball.
How many people got that? All right, you did very well. Now watch this part. You did. You didn't.
People who haven't seen or heard about a video like this before, about half missed the gorilla.
How many people who hadn't seen it saw the gorilla?
If you knew about the
Okay, a couple of you.
But did you notice the curtain changing color or the player on the lap team leaving the game? Let's rewind and watch it again. Here comes the gorilla, and there goes a player, and the curtain is changing from red to gold. When you're looking for a gorilla, you often miss other unexpected events. And that's the monkey business illusion.
There are a lot of permutations.
This illusion is the original gorilla experiment at theinvisiblegorilla.com.
There are a lot of similar experiments, but one of the interesting things is that it's relatively easy to distract you in a way that causes you to enhance your focus on something. So you start using up cognitive resources. If you're a little tired in the first place, it even makes it better, and you're not going to notice change. Now, this is probably a really smart thing. The overconfidence thing probably exists in part because if you were not overconfident, way back when, we would have stayed in our caves, starved and never mated with others, and we wouldn't pass on our genes. Now, mind you, lots of us went out of our caves and got eaten, but those that survived, they were confident, and they passed on their genes. So that explains that. Now, this one has a lot to do with the idea that we automatically and quite efficiently filter inbound information. And we can only cognitively handle a certain amount of load. And so one of the issues that confronts directors, I think, and we'll get into the exact mechanics of this, is how are you managing inbound cognitive load? How does that impact how you think about problems, how you look at problems, how you debate about problems, and what decisions you ultimately make? Do you do things that might be the equivalent of counting the white balls and missing the gorilla? And there's a real risk of that. So we did both of these, the gradual change, and this concept, by the way, called inundation and distraction. So the information on that video was inundating your inbound senses. You kind of used up a lot of your ability to think about things by watching it. And then you had distraction all at the same time because you had to focus quite a bit on the white balls. And because of those two things, your brain did exactly what you asked it to do. It counted the white balls and it sorted out everything else. And it's really a technique of interacting with complex information to be able to manage these issues in kind of the real world. So, all right, so if you could pass those quizzes that you took, kind of letter up. Just kind of pass them to the side and then up, and maybe we can collect them. That would be great. Okay, so this next part is actually a little bit tougher, but we'll see if we can do it. And then I get into a couple more things, then we're done. So here's the exercise we're going to do. This part of the room, I need you to do me a favor. For about a minute, I need you to turn around and look that way. I can't have you watch Team A. So just for a minute, you got to look away. Go conduct the experiment. This works about 58% of the time. Thank you very much. Thank you, thank you. Okay. Now, Team A. Now, these guys in the front, do they know what they're? So you two don't vote. You get to vote. They get to vote because they're faculty. You guys are all voting, right? So here's the question. So don't vote too fast, okay? You guys keep looking away, thanks. Don't vote too fast. I'll replay this for this other team, but for Team A, I'm going to do this. And I need you to pick which line is longer. But you have to, it's not a visual trick per se, but I need you to kind of pause, think about it, and then vote. You guys ready? George, you ready? Okay. So it's, hang on. So it's redrawing the same line. So now you need to pick, is it A? How many people say A is the longer one? All right. You guys say A? You guys are holding off? You sure? Absolutely sure? You guys stick to that? Wow, all right, so we'll end the experiment. It didn't work, that's good. You guys are good. All right, so here's what happens a little bit more than half. Thank you for, so here were the complicit players. I think if I'd gotten, Juan Antonio to vote, it might have swayed you, but here's what happens when you're tired. So it is clearly, in fact, okay, B, you guys can look again. We'll do the test for you real quick. Okay, so B group, take a look. Ready? Which is the longer line? So just take a look. So you got A and B. It's just redrawing it, same thing. I should have made it harder, huh? So which one's longer, A or B? B. All right. So what happens, and this worked in Denmark. You Chileans should be proud. Okay, so in Denmark, what I got them to do is I had the CEO of Lego and the head of their exchange, and they were all sitting in the front, and I had them vote, right? And it was exactly the same. B is a little bit bigger. It's about 8% longer than A, right? And without anyone who's not impaired can kind of see that. But what happens is, if you set up the group dynamic correctly, don't take any offense to this, what happens is that the people in the group, because there's a little bit of uncertainty, it's not up there, and you worry. And it turns out that a lot of studies pioneered by Solomon Asch in the 1950s, an American psychiatrist, demonstrated that if there's uncertainty, people would rather be following peer leaders than to be right, by and large. So 58% of college students who were put into a similar experiment would conform. What they would do is they'd get like 9 or 10 people. 5 or 6 of them would be told in advance, pick the wrong one. And it was matching up a line with 3 other lines and saying which one it was closest to. And then the others, about more than half the time, would conform. They would pick the wrong one. But what was really interesting, and they did a lot of stuff to sort this out, was that they didn't know that they were wrong. They weren't saying, oh, I want to be popular, I'll pick the wrong one. They actually thought they were picking the wrong one because their perception was distorted by the peer pressure that emerged. So this idea of resource depletion is that you're tired at the end of the day, you're a lot of stuff to do, and you tend to defer. If you don't have certainty, you'd end up deferring. So maybe it's because I had the whole overconfidence thing. I kind of bolstered your views on this. It feels voluntary. So it's not like you're saying, oh, I'm conforming so I can get along, but it's very hard to detect. And the majority of professionals in kind of a professional environment, turns out, would rather be wrong than alone. And this explains a lot of absence of kind of boisterous dissent in a lot of circumstances. Okay, so let's kind of back up and talk a little bit about the idea here of why this applies to the boardroom. So, a framework. I'm going to give a framework, and if you were here last year, this is kind of the same framework, slightly modified. So first, the enterprise, the business, whatever type of organization is arguably a vehicle. Let's hope it's on a long trip, right? So it's going somewhere. Management, the general manager is the CEO, is the driver. So they're the ones who are actually navigating the vehicle. Who are the passengers? So for most publicly traded companies, especially in the United States, this framework works well. The passengers are not the shareholders, by the way, right? The shareholders are arguably diversified. So they're standing way far away and watching all the trips, and they've got an interest in hopefully lots of different vehicles, right? Because they're a diversified shareholder. So the passengers are not the shareholders. The passengers are arguably the directors and maybe just the independent directors. So we frame this idea as the independent director as a backseat driver for a moment. So does that phrase exist in Spanish in Chile? Backseat driver? Okay. So a backseat driver, what's that? May. Okay, yeah. So it can be good and it can be bad. Let's kind of spell out how it's good or bad. Not most companies aren't that much fun. Hence, what we want to do, because we say that director is a backseat driver, we want to focus on their behaviors and their cognition, their decision making. So that's, we'll tease that out, see if it's at all useful. So good traits for a backseat driver, what might they be? Well, one good trait is they don't grab the steering wheel, right? You don't want a backseat driver reaching over and grabbing the steering wheel trying to drive. We know this happens in the United States sometimes in the form of non-executive chairs wanting to play a dominant role, but it manifests in different ways. But we know a good backseat driver doesn't grab the steering wheel. They understand the location and the direction of the car. This is obvious, but maybe not so obvious, which is to say they understand how the company operates, how it makes money, the context, the market, the way the market dynamics are evolving. So they understand everything about what it takes to drive and to drive well. They know how to read gauges and signs. I'm not so subtly saying they need to be able to understand finance and accounting and risk and other things. And they ask with some frequency, this isn't grabbing the wheel, this is just doing their job, where are we going? Are we there yet? Where are we going? Are we there yet? And then they, as we mentioned earlier today, they decide when to switch the driver, right? So the fundamental issue of succession. So is the driver sleepy? Are they drunk? Are they speeding? Do they go too slowly? So the backseat drivers have the moment to call when they want to replace the driver. So what does a backseat driver need to do to achieve all of these objectives? Well, they need to avoid some things. It's actually hard to say what makes a great director, but we can say what probably makes a bad director, because we know what mistakes they'll make based on what we just looked at and did with the exercises. So there's this idea of willful and change blindness. So we demonstrated change blindness a minute ago, which was, for a lot of reasons, you just don't spot the changes or you get distracted. You guys did not fall for the willful blindness. So the willful blindness would have been if you guys voted A. I tried really hard. I put up the A before the session started. I put A's in front of you. I did all sorts of stuff. It normally works. But you were better than that. So that's good. So that would be willful blindness. Willful blindness is when people should know better, kind of know better, but do it anyway. Switching, which I'll define, and inundation, which we had an example of. So the concept in part is this idea that directors often find themselves behaving as audience members, and the management is kind of the performer. And this is a very bad frame of mind because it sets you up to be more manipulated than you otherwise would be, or set aside manipulation. It decreases your probability of doing something that we call cooperative skepticism, which I'll get to in just a second. Directors should not actually be an audience. Obviously, they're the recipients of lots of information, but if they have an audience mindset, it creates a lot of different problems. So cooperative skepticism as a method. This is a defined idea that basically says, though you need to be skeptical, you have to do so in a way that advances the board. Boards need to have, good communication, good dynamics. People have to roughly get along or at least professionally respect each other. You can't make it an angry place or a place where people are constantly fighting, and I think we'll get some comments on that. But this idea of cooperative skepticism says you are able to pay attention, ask hard questions, ask where we're going, read the gauges, read the signs. So attentiveness actually requires technique. Did anyone ever take a course in school, grade school, middle school, high school, that was about attentiveness? Attentiveness, so paying attention, how to pay attention well. So there's a lot of techniques, and a couple of the books I recommend actually talk about that, but attentiveness is actually a technique that you develop over time, and some people develop it very, very well, and others don't. And there's a couple of modern phenomena that are making it very hard to be attentive. Let me mention something that comes from this Willful Blindness book, which I'm going to recommend for you. That is this idea of deep experts becoming more likely to be willfully blind, which is to say, there's this neurobiological foundation where essentially the way we learn early on, imagine a riverbed that isn't very deep at all. In fact, the water kind of wanders to and fro. But over time, as we develop expertise, it wears into a channel, right? And so over time, as you become more expert, your synaptic function, it appears, becomes more efficient and more effective at your area of expertise. But what's happening in part is that you're descending down into what you might think of as a grooved channel. Nothing wrong with that because that water now flows with remarkable efficiency, right? It just doesn't kind of meander, but it flows with force and efficiency, except that issue means that you become unaware in part of the blinders, which are kind of the walls of the canyon when you are in your kind of channel of expertise. And so that framing, we now kind of have the ability with functional MRIs, we can see people think about things and we can track what parts of their brain actually light up, and we know that the more expert you are at something, the less likely you are to be open or even to see, because it might be a gradual change, the alternative explanations, alternative variables, outside influences. And so this is something that you can't really change, and in fact you wouldn't want to change it, right? So a lot of adolescence, for example, your brain prunes itself. It destroys all sorts of synaptic connections because it's specializing. And if you didn't do that, you wouldn't be able to do the things you do. But you have to be somewhat aware of it. And it creates this irony of expertise. The more expert you are at something, there's kind of an English analogy, a phrase that says to a man with a hammer, every problem is a nail, right? So I'll say it one more time. So if to a man with a hammer, every problem is a nail, because you've got the nail, you've got the hammer, and everything's a nail. You can hammer it down. So perception of filtration. So this perception filtration means you sort out the things that don't fit your hammer, because that's how you've become so good at what you do. But it is its own disadvantage. So it's a good thing. It's not a critique about where you've arrived professionally. It's a good thing. So as a quick note about this, there's an interesting study that shows up in Willful Blindness. Dr. Alice Stewart. Has anyone ever heard that name? So she's the doctor who, in the early 40s in Great Britain, She'd been involved in the war effort. She was a very well-trained doctor, one of the few women doctors at the highest levels of Great Britain. She, as the war ended, was studying leukemia rates among 2 to 4-year-olds, and they had skyrocketed. They doubled and then doubled again. And so she was kind of an early epidemiologist, and what she found out, it's a remarkable story how she did it on very little budget, but she figured out that X-rays in utero were the causal factor. And it was really clear. The data was super, super good. She did that. She gathered all that evidence throughout the 50s and published it in Lancet in 1956, peer-reviewed, kind of the primo top level, and then in the British Medical Journal again in 1958, and she quantified very clearly that the risk of developing leukemia in children was increased 3-fold at any threshold of radiation exposure in utero. Before, there'd been this idea that there was a certain amount that could be exposed and wouldn't be a bad thing. So the question is, what changed and how quickly did it change? So this is broadly read by medical professionals taught in medical schools. The studies were repeated en masse, quite large epidemiological studies in 1960. And in 1964, the fairly prominent critic of all of her work recanted, reversed himself and said, okay, I think she's right. So my question is, what year do you think the American Medical Association stopped recommending X-rays for pregnant women? 1980. So it's about 1 million leukemia cases extra, by the way, in that time frame. Why? Well, one of the reasons is that it's very hard for someone who spends a career working to help people to have a sudden frame of mind to imagine that they've been hurting people for a long time. So there's kind of a natural neural dissonance, which isn't real open to this idea. Secondly, there's a lot of forward momentum structurally to continuing to have that behavior because you and your partners invested money in a device that's quite expensive. You only hear the parts here every once in a while, but everybody else seems to say it's a good thing. Now, mind you, they aren't the experts, they're the salespeople, but everyone else seems to say it's a good thing. But this is one of the kind of clearest examples of professionals in the know, in concurrence, who didn't change their behavior at all, but then once they did, looked back and are quite mortified. If you read the kind of discussions post like 1978, 1980, these changes were made aggressively and with much concern. So what behaviors then apply to the boardroom and how might it matter? So I'm going to talk briefly about distraction, this idea of switching. We mentioned inundation. Blindness, so I recommend Willful Blindness by Heffernan, so it's a great book. And then something I'm not going to get to, we're not going to talk about, but we talked about last year, was automated influence responses that are a part of these set of behaviors that directors engage in when they don't mean to, and it's captured in a book called Influence by Robert Cialdini. Okay, so the one thing I'm going to pick on, and then we're going to kind of switch over because we've only got a few more minutes for my session here. The one thing I'm going to pick on is this idea of multitasking. So how many people had a conference call this week that you're on a conference call? Raise your hand. Okay. How many of you muted the conference call while you're on the conference call at any time during the conference call? Okay, about 2/3 of you. Why did you mute the conference call? What's that? Standard practice? Okay, so you're courteous, you don't want background noise. What's the other reason you muted the conference call, even if it weren't standard practice? Right, because you don't want them to hear the typing while you're on the conference call, right? Because you're typing, or you don't want them to hear you talking to the person who came into your office briefly, just briefly, you mute it and chat with the person, then you unmute it. Now, I think in everyday life, I'm not arguing that multitasking is a terrible thing. It's not necessarily a terrible thing. But in the context of a director role, you actually have a fiduciary duty not to just bring half your brain to the boardroom. And it turns out that multitasking really does impair you. So you can multitask while I'm talking. You have no fiduciary duty to me to actually listen with your full attention. See, George, he's heard this before, and he can multitask and it doesn't matter, right? But if you're in a boardroom, we know that, in fact, this idea of multitasking just doesn't exist. It doesn't work at all, right? You actually switch back and forth from things. And maybe you're pretty good at switching, but it actually has a cost, and it reduces your cognitive function, it reduces your likelihood of being right, and it reduces your ability, this is the really interesting one, to catch unusual details nuances in facial expression, discern if people are telling you the truth. It reduces a lot of the very higher order stuff, which you do subconsciously to a certain extent, but if you impair yourself by multitasking, you don't do. So we now know this. We have this great lab, mainly sort of about cars at Stanford, and a guy named Cliff Nass is the pioneer of most of this stuff, that shows us, while you multitask, things happen to your brain, and not only do bad things happen to your brain, while you're multitasking, over time, you train yourself to be distracted by stuff, because your brain kind of likes being distracted a little bit. And so we resist this result. Most people just don't believe that you're genuinely impaired if you multitask, because you say, I multitask every day. In fact, I could not survive if I didn't multitask all day, every day. And it again, is because you're really buying into this switching idea. And you're fooling yourself into thinking that you can multitask. You're just good at switching back and forth and giving partial attention to things. And so worse, we're multiholics. So one of the things you can try later today is if you're in an elevator or standing somewhere where there's a group of people, if they're not doing this already, pull out your phone in a prominent way, kind of square up your shoulders, and start doing stuff. Then pause and look left and right, and most people will pull out their phones. It's kind of a yawn response. It's because people actually get a positive dopamine hit when they, in fact, check their email, when they check their devices. So and this stems from long-known kind of neurobiological responses. So which rats in the laboratory get fat? The ones when they press the little red button, the pellet comes, or the ones when they press the little red button, sometimes the pellet comes, sometimes the little food pellet doesn't come? It's the latter, right? Because the excitement of maybe getting the pellet, that's part of the enchantment of pressing the red button, and hence they actually are the ones who get fatter. So it turns out that in terms of like BlackBerry and iPhone use, we have an almost compulsion, and there's now an addiction. It's labeled, they're going to categorize it, but we are and intelligent, highly professional, busy people are more so. So question about brownouts. So again, I'm just going to try to persuade you of this, because it's arguably one of the worst things that happens in boardrooms, and I know it feels inevitable, but if you can change this behavior, you'll be that much better of a board member. How many of you have ever talked on your cell phone while you're driving home? How many people drive back and forth? Okay, most of you drive. So you've been talking to your cell phone while you're driving home. Have you ever arrived home really quickly? Kind of you arrive home and you're like, wow, that was a quick trip. Well, that happens because about 8% of your brain was being used for the driving, and 92% of your brain was being used for the talking, and hence you kind of didn't notice it. And this is called a brownout. We can track it, we can scan your brain while you're doing this, and we can see what happens. It turns out that when you're talking on the phone and driving, technically, the driving is the distraction from the phone, as a technical matter. And so you're still in denial, and I'll move off it in the next one. So cognitive reserve, why can you do it? Because most of the things you do all day do not require 100% of your cognition. You are intelligent, successful people, and you've got a lot of reserve. It's kind of like you can still have a conversation after 2 pisco sours, right? You can still talk. You don't want to, engage in surgery or draft a brief, but you can still talk. So you have a lot of cognitive reserve, and you kind of fool yourself into thinking that's enough. And I'm going back to this fiduciary duty point, which is you owe the board, the company, the shareholders, all that you bring to bear, and otherwise it's cheating. Eating and ironing, yes, you can do 2 things at once, especially if you don't need to learn from them or remember them. So you can eat and iron and watch TV, that's fine, right? But again, it depends on what the task is. Walking, not parking. So my favorite story is, I'm from Arizona, a state that has lots of land, has large malls that have huge parking lots, and people always lose their car in the parking lot, right? Happens all the time, which is fine. But that rate of loss spiked a lot starting about 6 or 7 years ago, and they couldn't figure out why. They thought, well, maybe people are getting older, maybe the parking lot configuration's messed up. In the end, after sorting out the data, because this was a big deal, it actually consumed a lot of resources. People get panicked when they think their car has been stolen. What turned out to be the case is that if you are talking on your phone while you park, you're impairing your hippocampus function, and you can't convert your short-term memory to longer-term memory. So if you are gone long enough from when you parked while you were talking on your phone, and I've done this, I'm sure you've done this, you talk and talk, you even park, and you finish, talk and talk and talk, then you're done, and you get out, you walk away, you didn't code the memory as well when you were talking on your phone, and that's what they figured out it was. So you're perfectly fine to walk and distract yourself and whistle and talk and do whatever you want, but you shouldn't park, as a side note. So, and then finally, mimicry and expert reliance. Turns out that you still make pretty good decisions because you're distracted, and I'm sure you've done this a couple times. So you're in a presentation, and you're doing email, and then suddenly everyone applauds. What do? You applaud as well, right? Or you may not even know you do this, but if everyone starts nodding around you, as you're emailing, you'll nod, right? Because we have this natural ability to mimic the kind of behaviors around us. And so what's interesting there is if you want to be really mean about it, I would say you're perpetrating a fraud on your board. So not only are you multitasking, not giving us your best brain, but you're actually pretending falsely like you're fully participating. You nod at the right times, and then when the vote comes, you look to the guy you really trust, right? And you raise your hand just like him. So there's this mimicry and expert reliance. Pilots are concerned about this, and so they have a very formal handoff of who's flying the plane at any given moment. If you're in a cockpit, it seems like a really bizarre thing when they do it. They're like, you have the controls, I have the controls, you have the controls. They actually say it back and forth like that to make sure that they don't accidentally think the other one's flying the plane. So what should you do? I'm going to jump straight to the punchline. You should do video conferences or live meetings. You shouldn't do audio calls. I know that's, you're like, but we have to. Okay, we know it's not as good, but you shouldn't. Advanced delivery of materials. If you don't get stuff well enough in advance, you suffer from inundation. If you read it all on the plane before the meeting, you don't have time to absorb and process it. You need to preview the materials extensively. That's inundation again. And then you should prohibit last-minute delivery of information. The information that you pay the most attention to is the shiniest and newest, and that may not be the most important, so you need to be careful about how often you get last-minute information. Then finally, you should have multiple sources of inbound information. That's a more complicated topic. And then for meetings, if you're not 100% engaged, you should leave the room. No one's going to hold against you. You're busy. But if you're actually having to, you get up and leave. That way you're not perpetrating the fraud. And if like 3 of you got up and leave, you say, oh, we need to take a break. Turn your back. This is an idea from an academic who developed this, and he actually does this. If you don't want to leave the room, fine. Make a rule that if you're multitasking, you got to spin your chair around and face out. And then you can turn back around when you're actually engaged. No one will do that. It just sets a norm. Take frequent breaks. After 50 minutes or so, your ability to kind of capture information and process it in real time goes way down, and you end up becoming almost entirely change blind. You won't notice subtle changes. Like if my hair turned yellow very slowly at this point, a lot of you wouldn't notice it. And then use the old school method, which is put all your pieces and devices to someone sitting outside, and they can always come and get you if they need you to come and do. And then finally, last one, agenda management. Careful with seating and technology. PowerPoints, ironically, are a great way to get people to look in one direction and then not actually ask harder questions. Pause long enough for questions. Most of the time, it takes 6 to 10 seconds for someone to process your request for questions and then to frame a question even if they're prepared to ask it. So if you really don't want someone to ask a question, say, are there any questions? 1, 2, great. Let's move on. So pause long enough for questions, and then avoid putting important discussions last. I don't know how many of you have had this happen, but you got the important thing, you got all the materials. In fact, you moved it to the end of the agenda because they gave you a bunch of new materials at the beginning of the meeting because it's important and urgent, and it gets crammed into the last 45 minutes, so you're time pressured, you're inundated, you're what we call resource depleted, and you don't feel like doing questions. And guess what? That peer pressure behavior thing is really, most of the problems are not like the lines. One is not clearly longer than the other. It's more subtle than that. So you end up compressing a lot of your ability into that. And then finally, use consistent, familiar, boring venues. Those fancy venues, they actually create cognitive load because there's all sorts of new stuff to look at, right? So if you're outside on a beautiful deck and there's waves in the background and the breeze blowing, unless you do that every time, which that would be fine, I guess, but unless you do that every time, that new setting actually creates cognitive load, and we know I could persuade you to do more things in that scenario and make you take riskier bets. So I'm just going to stop there. I will save the questions for when we flip over to the panel. That way we don't take any more time. Thank you.